Dear Father in heaven, thank you, Lord, for your truths. Thank you for your love for us, your prophetic messages, that they do not leave us in doubt of where we are, that you love us, and you do not leave us directionless, Father, with no idea of where we are or where we're going, but that you speak to your people through your prophets. I pray, Lord, that we'll have an understanding of the times that we're living in, of these critical days, Lord, and that we will be prepared in heart and mind to do the work that you are raising up a people to do. I pray this in Jesus' holy name. Amen. So, there was a children's story prepared, but we've missed out on them coming by a little while. So, I don't want to miss the thought, though, that I wanted to share in that children's story. So if they were to come in, they might catch it. And it's really just a simple thought, but it has huge implications for what we're studying at the time and how we're understanding our history. We understand that the great controversy began in heaven, spilled down to this earth. And what characterized this beginning of the great controversy? Was a characteristic of the beginning. Satan in heaven or in the Garden of Eden, his work had the same characteristic, and that was that it was based on a lie, or on a series of lies. Not necessarily just clear-cut lies, but based on manipulating truth, misrepresenting God. How does the great controversy end? I would suggest one of the main principles of this movement is that God teaches us the end from the beginning. This was a period which was really Satan's messages, Satan's work was based on lies and disinformation and fake news. The end of the world is seeing the exact same characteristics. It's ending with lies like we've never, I would suggest, seen before, where the majority of people out there in the world, well-meaning people, through largely no fault of their own, are having trouble identifying what is truth and what is a lie. So it becomes particularly important for God's people at the end of the world to identify between the lies and between the truth. There has never been the fall of an empire that God has not given his people warning of, whether that was Babylon and Belshazzar, or Medo-Persia, Cyrus, and then you have Artaxerxes, and then you have pagan Rome, and then you have papal Rome. God doesn't just instruct us on the internal workings, on the internal events and experience of his people. He also, through the rise and fall of every world empire, has given us instructions not just on the characteristics of what it looks like, but also the time. And God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. If that is the way he has worked through the rise and fall of successive empires, that is how he's going to work today. And God is not going to leave us floundering between identifying what is truth and what is error. So I want to spend the majority of this morning's study looking at the principal verse that this movement was founded on, and that is Daniel 11 verse 40. But we're going to work up to that verse. If you could turn to Daniel chapter 12 verse 4. Daniel 12 verse 4. And it says, "But thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book, even to the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased." So this last vision of Daniel's, he's instructed, is to be shut up and sealed. Until when? Until the time of the end, when many shall run to and fro. In context, what are they running to and fro in? The words of the book of Daniel. And because they are working through the book of Daniel, there will be an increase of knowledge. So when is the time of the end? Great Controversy 356.2. Great Controversy 356.2. No such message has ever been given in past ages. Paul, as we have seen, did not preach it. He pointed his brethren into the then far distant future for the coming of the Lord. The Reformers did not proclaim it. Martin Luther placed the judgment about 300 years in the future from his day. But since 1798 the book of Daniel has been unsealed, knowledge of the prophecies has increased, and many have proclaimed the solemn message of the judgment near. Since 1798 the book of Daniel has been unsealed. People ran to and fro in the pages of that book, and there was an increase of knowledge. So what we can see is that the time of the end spoken of equals 1798, and it equals an unsealing of knowledge. And that is that at the time of the end. If you'll then turn to Daniel 11 verse 40. Daniel 11:40 says, "And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him." That's as far as I want to read to begin with. So at the time of the end, or 1798, when the book of Daniel is unsealed, there is war between the king of the north and the king of the south. And this is a war between the king of the north and the king of the south that has filled the majority of the book of Daniel, book of chapter 11 of Daniel. So it says at the time of the end, 1798, the king of the south is going to push against the king of the north. That word for push means to butt with the horns, figuratively to war against. So we should see in 1798 a war between the king of the north and the king of the south. Great Controversy 439.2 gives us one other characteristic that we are to see at the time of the end. Great Controversy 439.2 says, "Power was given unto him to continue 42 months. And says the prophet, I saw one of his heads as it was wounded to death. And again, he that leadeth into captivity shall go into captivity. Note, he that kills with the sword must be killed with the sword." Has the papacy killed with the sword for 42 months? So is it going to be killed with the sword? Yes. The 42 months are the same as the time and times and the dividing of time, or the 3.5 years, or the 1260 days of Daniel chapter 7. The time during which the papal power was to oppress God's people. This period, as stated in preceding chapters, began with the supremacy of the papacy in AD 538 and terminated 1260 years later in 1798. At that time, the Pope was made captive by the French army, and the papal power received its deadly wound. And the prediction was fulfilled, he that leadeth into captivity shall go into captivity. So 1798 marks the deadly wound. That's the characteristic I want to pull from this passage. The time of the end marks 1798. An unsealing of the book of Daniel, and a deadly wound. But if we go into these Bible histories, sometimes it isn't so simple as just the plain reading would indicate. I want to read to you just a little bit of the history leading up to 1798. At the outbreak of the French Revolution, which began in 1789, Pius VI witnessed the suppression of the old Gallican church, as well as the confiscation of pontifical and ecclesiastical possessions in France. He also saw an effigy of himself burnt in Paris. He saw these events as a sign of opposition against the social order ordained by God, and also viewed it as a conspiracy against the Church. Pius VI condemned both the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the civil constitution of the clergy, and supported a league against the revolution. And he began to write against the French Revolution. 1791 marked the end of diplomatic relations with France. So in 1791, diplomatic relationships is severed between France and the papacy. In 1796, the French Republican troops under the command of Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Italy and defeated the papal troops. So in 1796, you have an open war, a battle between France and the papacy. Napoleon defeating the papal troops. The French occupied Ancona and Loreto. Pius VI sued for peace, which was granted at Tolentino on the 19th of February 1797. But on the 28th of December that same year, 1797, a riot blamed by papal forces on some Italian and French revolutionists, the popular General Dufault, who had gone to Rome with Bonaparte as part of the French embassy, was killed by the papal troops, and a new pretext was furnished for invasion. General Berthier marched to Rome, entered it unopposed on the 10th of February 1798, and proclaimed a Roman Republic, and demanded of the Pope the renunciation of his temporal authority. And this is the 10th of February. Upon his refusal, Pius was taken prisoner, and on the 20th of February was escorted from the Vatican to Siena, and thence to Certosa near Florence. The French declaration of war against Tuscany led to his removal. He removed from place to place, where he died 6 weeks after the arrival in Valence on the 29th of August 1799, having then reigned longer than any pope up to that time. So he dies 1799 on the 29th of August. He was at this stage well over 80 years of age, and his health never recovered when he was taken captive and moved from location to location to location. So if we mark Daniel 11:40 part A, this battle between the north and the south, we can see that it's a war that begins earlier. You could mark in 1789. So what is Daniel 11:40 part A marking at the time of the end? I would suggest what it's marking is the infliction of the deadly wound and the end of the 1260. This is what marks the time of the end. He that leadeth into captivity shall go into captivity. He goes into captivity in 1798. He that killeth with the sword must be killed with the sword. If you turn to Daniel chapter 2 verse 37. Daniel 2 verse 37. Thou, O king, this is Daniel talking to Nebuchadnezzar, thou, O king, art a king of kings, for the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, and power, and strength, and glory. And wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field, and the fowls of the heaven hath he given into thine hand, and hath made thee ruler over them all. Thou art this head of gold. So when you think of that statue, what did the head of gold represent? Babylon. But who does this verse say it represents? Nebuchadnezzar. This takes us to another important Bible principle, that a king equals a kingdom. They can be used in prophecy interchangeably. And this aspect, it's important for us to see when considering the next quote. 8MR 354.1. This is Ellen White describing her visit in France, her travels in France. She says, that afternoon, the afternoon of November 2, he, Elder Bordeaux, had us accompany him to the cathedral in Valence, France, and look upon the bust of Pius VI, who was noted in prophecy. Who was noted in prophecy? Pius VI is noted in prophecy. Where in prophecy? In the book of Daniel. Who was led into captivity and died in captivity. He was the one, Pius VI, marked in history, who received the deadly wound. His heart is encased in the marble monument beneath where the bust is located. We felt rather solemn as we looked upon the monument of this man noted in prophecy. Who received the deadly wound? Pius VI. Is both a king and a kingdom. But did he die in 1798? When was he that killed with the sword killed by the sword? 1799. The time of the end marks the deadly wound, it doesn't mark the death. So you have a period of warfare beginning years previously, leading up to a deadly wound that then brings about the death in 1799, whether you see that as a king or a kingdom. Go back to Daniel 11 verse 40 and we will read part B. So what we considered was at the time of the end, 1798, the king of the south, atheistic France, pushes or wars against the king of the north. And the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. When is this? So at one time of the end, the king of the south wars against the king of the north. That's atheistic France. Atheistic France went underground. It rose up, tried to rise up in the revolutions in Europe in 1848, but they were suppressed. The next time you see that atheistic, hostile to God or religion force arise again was in the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, which grew into the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is what engaged or fought against the papacy all across Europe from its setting up in 1922. The king of the north, the papacy, comes against the king of the south, atheistic Russia, like a whirlwind with chariots, with horsemen and with many ships, so with economic and military strength. We've studied these verses in detail, so we're not going deep. I just want us to remind ourselves and pick up these principles. Because we have two time of the ends marked. The first time of the end marks the king of the south coming against the king of the north. The second time of the end marks the king of the north coming against the king of the south, with military and economic strength. This war between the North and the South, between the Soviet Union and the papacy, which was connecting itself with a new beast, with the United States, began in 1945. At the end of the Second World War, what began was the Cold War. The war between the king of the north and the king of the south preceded 1798. Most of the activity happened in the history prior. And most of this history happens between 1945 and 1989. The 9th of November. So the Cold War extended from 1945 until when? The Cold War ended with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. And if you do your math, that's a 46-year history. In 1989, by 1989, the Polish Solidarity Movement, the economic restrictions placed upon it by the United States, the arms race, the Voice of America radio, and this union between John Paul II and Ronald Reagan had so weakened that the Soviet Union that the breakdown between East and West began. So in this history, you have a war between the North and the South. You have an alliance between the papacy and between the United States. This culminates in 1989 with what I would describe as a deadly wound. What we already understand to mark the time of the end. I want to read to you an excerpt from an article written by a woman who was at the Berlin Wall when it fell. She says, "All of us felt that this was the moment when something violent could happen. And as I learned a few years ago from a German historian who looked at the archives of that time, they weren't far from the truth. Not far away from the Brandenburg Gate, as we were sitting on the wall, the men of the East German Politburo were debating what to do about the unruly crowd then teasing the guards. Among other options, they considered shooting into the crowd. But they did not shoot, nor had they chosen to shoot in Leipzig, the city where huge anti-communist demonstrations had taken place a few weeks earlier, although the hospitals were cleared and blood plasma was prepared for an attack that never came. So they are preparing, even the hospitals are preparing for a violent engagement. Why? Why did they let the demonstrations take place? She says the history of Europe would have been far more tragic if either one of those decisions had been different. But by 1989, the East German leadership no longer believed in its own propaganda. Nobody, not the guard who let the first people through the Berlin Wall, and not the men who ran the country, wanted to kill their fellow citizens for something they didn't believe in. This was why the demonstrations across Eastern Germany mattered. They didn't bring down the regime, but they demoralized it. Once politicians understood that society opposed them utterly, they lost the will to impose their system by force. What the government recognized in 1989 was that their propaganda machine had failed. People no longer believed in their own propaganda, and what's worse, the leaders didn't believe it any longer either. So after these demonstrations take place in 1989, the fall is inevitable. They've already denied their own theology. They've already rejected these ideas of communism. But did the Soviet Union die in 1989? No, it's just wounded. And again, the time of the end is marking a wounding, not a death. December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as president of the Soviet Union, transferring control of the country's huge nuclear arsenal to the new Russian president Boris Yeltsin, as the red Soviet flag atop the Kremlin was lowered for the last time. So, king of the kingdom who falls in 1991? The Soviet Union and Gorbachev. The day that Gorbachev stepped down was the day that the Soviet Union ceased to exist. Immediately after announcing his resignation in a live television broadcast, the last leader of the world's first communist state signed a decree formally relinquishing command of the armed forces. Within a half hour, the white, red and blue Russian flag was flying above Gorbachev's former Kremlin office, symbolizing the end of the Soviet Union and the collapse of Soviet communism 74 years after the Bolshevik Revolution. They describe this ceremony, the small crowd, apparently a handful of tourists that gathered to watch that Soviet Union flag be taken down at the Kremlin. They say it was strange how little reaction there was. When the Berlin Wall came down, everybody was out on the streets. This was an event of the same kind of magnitude, but no one seemed to care. They didn't care because it was already inevitable from 1989. The wound was there. This is just marking death. So we have parallel time of the ends, 1798 and 1989. What do we know about this deadly wound? Turn to Revelation 13 verse 3. Revelation 13 verse 3. It says, "And I saw one of his heads as it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast." So this deadly wound and the death that occurs in 1799, is that wound healed? Is this fatal? It's fatal here, but there's a resurrection. This is the counterfeit of the death and resurrection of Christ, the death and resurrection of the papacy. So was this deadly wound the end of the story for the King of the South? No, that wound is healed and it resurrects. That's what this movement has been coming to understand. If we bring everything we know back to Daniel 11 verse 40, the key is in that one verse. It comes down to paralleling those two times of the ends, and then we see extra evidence to back up what we've already been teaching. And then really all we are is adding layers onto this verse. So what this movement failed to understand was that the King of the South was not finally defeated in 1989, that he comes back into history. This is the light that has been increasing since 2014. I want to demonstrate that briefly. If we just redraw this. We're just going to track some of this history. What we want to do is track this relationship. And one of the main things that I'm wanting us to see is the period of time. That it's not just a couple of dates in history, but it's really the story of a relationship. Because what we've been doing in this movement is filling in the gaps in between, primarily. So, in 2014 we came to understand what truth?
Ezra 7.
The truth of Ezra 7. So if we understand 1798, then I want to mark 1989, and we overlaid these two as having the same characteristics. We understood in the 1798, the King of the South defeated the King of the North. In 1989, the King of the North defeated the King of the South. What this movement came to understand in 2014 was that there was two waymarks that preceded the Sunday law. And we marked them as midnight and midnight cry, that precede the Sunday law. 2016, there was an increase of light on this subject. And what did that teach us? What 2016 opened up was those first 39 verses of Daniel chapter 11. And now, for the first time, we understood that there is a resurrection of the King of the South, and it comes back into our history. With that resurrection, we understood that in those first 39 verses, it's describing two battles, the Battle of Raphia and the Battle of Panium, and other details. But what we primarily pull is Raphia and Panium. And we understood that this is where these powers go back into open conflict, back into war. At the Battle of Raphia, the king of the south wins against the king of the north. At Panium, the king of the north defeats the king of the south. And this really marks the conclusion of the matter. And what we also understand is that this again is progressive. If 1989 was a deadly wound, Panium is a deadly wound. Which means, is the king of the south dead at Panium? No. Its fall is progressive until Sunday law. It's at Sunday law you see the full and complete defeat of the king of the south. And the end of Daniel 11 verse 40, the beginning of verse 41, which marks the Sunday law. That verse 40 really takes us all the way from 1798 to the Sunday law, and we're just filling in that history in between. So we understood these two battles of Raphia and Panium, and now I just want to look at what we've been discussing recently, the light that has come to us through Pyrrhus. 2018 adds another layer onto this history. And now we have an understanding of the history from 2014. So when we looked at the true and the counterfeit, we understood that there is the beginning of modern Israel, and the end of modern Israel. When is the beginning of modern Israel? This is the story of the Millerites. When is the end of modern Israel? It's the story of the 144,000. If we take that and we apply it to the counterfeit, we understand that there is a beginning of modern Babylon. And then there is an end of modern Babylon. And to understand the history of the 144,000, we take the history of the Millerites and we overlay it and make application. To understand the end of modern Babylon, we understand the beginning of modern Babylon. And the beginning of modern Babylon, if we understand it through Pyrrhus, is the history of World War I and World War II. And the end of modern Babylon, we're marking in the history of World War III, which is the history of World War I and World War II combined. Pyrrhus gave us the history of World War II as the alpha history between a war between the King of the North and the King of the South. By 1939, the papacy had found a beast in Nazi Germany and was attempting to ride it. They had the same goal, to take down Stalin and the Soviet Union. This is a history that we have overlaid with our own, the history of World War II. So the King of the South is defeated in 1798. In this history here, the King of the South is attempting to resurrect and again to strike the King of the North. And when it first attempts to do that is in the history of World War II. This is the history of Hitler's Pope, where Pope Pius XII united with Hitler in this invasion of the Soviet Union. They had the same goal. Their goal was to take down Stalin and the Soviet Union. So the papacy finds a beast, he tries to ride it, and they both take on the King of the South, the Soviet Union. That fails. Who failed in that history? Hitler. Hitler failed. The beast failed. The papacy knew what its end goal was, but Hitler was not a good beast to ride, so it had to find a new beast, and it found that new beast in the United States. So we take this history of World War II, and that is what we're able to overlay with our history. It's the history of the beginning of modern Babylon. World War I and World War II that ended in a disappointment and failure, as did the Millerite history. There's so much we can pull from understanding that. But what this history of World War II, World War I, particularly World War II, has given us is the history of warfare, that this isn't just about one or two battles, but it's actually a whole period of war. There was no battle between the papacy and France in 1798. They fought in 1796, but there was no battle in 1798. Neither between the Soviet Union and the United States in 1989. So what it forces us to consider is how inspiration treats the use of the symbols of warfare and battles and revolutions. These are all parables, but what are they parables of? This relationship between the King of the North and the King of the South is not defined by one event. It's a period of time. And the closer we get more into these events, the more light we have about what is occurring. And what we've come to understand, particularly with Pyrrhus, in overlaying the history of World War II, it begins with an alliance between the King of the North and the King of the South, something no one expects to see. These are mortal enemies, polar opposites, and to the shock of everyone, they go into some type of alliance. The world was amazed when it came to light that Stalin and Hitler had gone into alliance because they were mortal enemies, but they did in 1939. This alliance was with a purpose. The purpose of alliance between the North and the South was that they had one common goal. The King of the North had to take on a threefold enemy. And to do that, he needed to have the backing, the support of the King of the South. The King of the North is facing a threefold enemy. And he must have the King of the South as an ally to fight that battle. Who was the threefold enemy in the history of World War II? You have the Triple Alliance. In the history of 2016, you have the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branch of the United States government. Hitler took Poland in a day. He had a prolonged war with France and with England, with Britain. Donald Trump took the executive branch in a day. Now he has a prolonged war with the judicial and the legislative. We can see that right now. Particularly right now, as the US government has just shut down, 20% of it is not actually functioning. 800,000 federal employees in the United States are not getting paid. So you can see that this is a real battle. First an alliance, then a battle against a threefold enemy. Then we can overlay the history also of Pyrrhus, which gives us another layer. Pyrrhus gives us the Battle of Raphia and the Battle of Panium. But these are described in Pyrrhus's war with Rome as Asculum and Beneventum. This is Asculum and Beneventum. They have the same characteristics as the Battle of Raphia and Panium. But it gives us two other prior battles. It gives us the Battle of Ipsus and the Battle of Heraclea. And we have those battles from the lines of Pyrrhus. So if we track the development of this relationship, we see in 1798 the King of the North and the King of the South come against each other. The King of the South defeats the King of the North. Then you have this period where the King of the North is attempting to come back. He fails. He succeeds in coming back again by aligning himself with the United States. And in 1989, the King of the South is defeated. A deadly wound for the king of the north, a deadly wound for the king of the south. Neither of them have been finally fully defeated. And then, to shock, there is an alliance between the king of the north and the king of the south. The reason for this alliance is that there is a battle that the king of the north is about to go into, and to engage in that battle, to win, he needs the king of the south. That's the history of 2016, collusion, and then the US election. Then we see that alliance turn sour. They start to have conflicting interests, and that's one thing that I want to spend more time this afternoon looking at, is what actually happened in 2018. This relationship between them goes sour, but then it is that breach is repaired for a period of time, but it's completely broken down at the Battle of Raphia. This again is a battle like these between the king of the north and the king of the south. The south wins, the north is defeated, which takes us to Panium. When the north wins, the south is defeated, and we understand that it is fully destroyed, done away with at Sunday law. So what we're doing really is tracking a relationship. In overlaying the histories of the time of the end, we can see that they're described as a battle, 1798, 1989. But it forces us to consider what a battle looks like. How are ancient wars used in the Bible to describe what is happening today? And how do we determine what a battle, war, or a revolution looks like? The point I particularly wanted to establish is that the battle occurs in the history previous. This battle against the three levels of the US government, when does it begin? Began in 2014. Putin wasted no time beginning to work against or interfere with the US election process. He began that in 2014. And you can go back to the history between 2014 and 2016 to see the war. And you can look at one day in 2016 to see the battle. If we take the Battle of Heraclea, where does it begin? As soon as Donald Trump wins the presidential nomination, the presidency, Putin actually doubled his work, cyber war against the United States. That information war that he was conducting from 2014 to 2016 to interfere with the American election doubles after 2016, after Trump wins. You can map that battle progressively until Heraclea. You can mark a day. When does Raphia begin? It's going to occur all of next year. We can already start to see this warfare in action. This is why it's important for us to not turn off the news. The idea is shared around the movement and around God's church that we're to look only to inspiration to guide us. If the Millerites didn't open whatever newspaper they had and see that France took the Pope captive in 1798, do they have a time of the end? They don't have a time of the end. They had to actually open whatever type of newspaper they were looking at to understand 1798. The same way that we've had to look at histories. When we go back into the historical catalogue of Raphia and Panium, all you're looking is at an ancient journalist with his own bias described to you a battle which he's writing about in whatever version of newspapers they were using back then. We've always looked to the external to understand. And I would suggest that we're not to change that behaviour now. The idea that we're not to look and understand external events, I would suggest, is a satanic attack. Satan has learnt through years in this movement that he cannot separate us from the Word of God. He can't separate us from Daniel 11:40 to 45. But he can separate us from external forces. So since 2014, when you see this war come back into play, you see also propaganda machines beginning to work, and they're severing us from our source of external news. And that has been growing not just in the movement among God's people, but also in much of the world, particularly the United States, where they now say they cannot tell truth from error because they no longer know who to believe. We have to be understanding the external events that are happening around us. We've had to be understanding those external events for 6,000 years, and I wouldn't suggest anything has changed now. So we overlaid the history of World War II over this, 2014, and the history of World War II becomes the 23rd of August, 1939, in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The two foreign ministers of the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany that met to sign this alliance, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, on the 23rd of August. The reason they needed this pact was a fight against the three allies of France, Britain and Poland that Hitler launched on the 1st of September 1939. And this marks the beginning of war on the Western Front. This is a two-front war. The King of the North, Germany, or Trump, is waging war on the Western and the Eastern Front. We haven't yet begun the Eastern Front that begins at the Battle of Raphia. When you see Trump attack NATO, attack the European Union, or attack his own agencies, the FBI, the CIA, what he's engaging in is war on the Western Front. Then we see this relationship sour. This occurred in August of 1940. There was a breakdown in their alliance, and we're going to look at that more this afternoon. And then their alliance fully disintegrates when Hitler decides to wage war against the Soviet Union, against Stalin. And he invades the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June, 1941. This was Operation Barbarossa. In 1945, you see the end of the war. As we said up here, it ended in a disappointment, just like the Millerites ended in a disappointment. This was the history of a failure, and we understood that the Soviet Union won, Hitler is defeated. Donald Trump is not defeated here. It's a history of success. So we can overlay the history of World War II. We can take it as a broad history all the way from 1939 to 1945, and we can overlay that within our history and see 2014 to Panium. But what I want us to see that becomes relevant this afternoon is another way that we look at that history. For some of you, this may be completely new, but it is something that we've already established. For those of you that have watched those studies, you've already bought into this idea. Perhaps you just haven't noticed that this is what we did. We understood that the Battle of Raphia, which we've already agreed is November 9, 2019, we've already understood that battle is occurring in November 9 of 2019. And we overlaid that with the history of World War II, which became the 22nd of June of 1941. And then we began to look at this date of November 9 and look at that date in history. And it took us to quite a few histories, right back to the Reformation, back to 1893 was a neat one that all gave us more insights onto what this battle and this time period looked like. It didn't just show us what this day looked like or this battle, but this whole progressive year. What we did when we looked at those dates was we went back 81, took the symbol of the number 81 and the symbol of November 9 and looked back to November 9 of 1938 and the night of broken glass. So now, over this date, which I'm going to refer to as Asculum, I'd like us to try and use the battles from Pyrrhus so we can keep them in sequence. So instead of Raphia, the Battle of Asculum. We've seen that that is the 22nd of June 1941, Operation Barbarossa. But we've also agreed that it's the Night of Broken Glass, the beginning of persecution, which was what date? November 9, 1938. So what we've done is we've taken a date out of sequence. This is August of 1940, this is 1938, this is 1945. It's not in sequence. So what we can understand is that we can take the whole history, the history of World War II, and overlay it and place that over our history. The exact same thing we do with Millerite history, the beginning of modern Babylon illustrating the end, the First World Wars illustrating the Third World War. But in doing that, we can take the whole history, or we can focus on just one date that is not necessarily in sequence. Our understanding of prophetic numbers, such as the number 81, gives us the license to do this, but it has implications, and the reason that I want us to recognize that now is because I want to do that again this afternoon. We're going to take another date and bring that into our history. So on the 23rd of August 1939, Hitler is well established in power. Is Donald Trump in power in 2014? No. Another thing that is interesting, when you watch the news, the external news, and you see some very high-profile people within the US government, those that are aware of what Donald Trump is doing, what they're saying in a very intelligent, well-articulated manner is that the United States is in 1933 Germany. And they're saying we're not in 1939. We're in 1933. And I would suggest that they're also correct. You can lay this history in different ways. This is not only Hitler's war against the Soviet Union, against West and against East. This is also Hitler's rise to power. And that is something that is being well recognized in the United States by those who are awake to this. One thing that can also teach us is does it actually matter where we place Hitler? If we take Hitler in 1933, is he any different to what he was in 1939? He's no different. He has the same policies here as he had here. What he did under the Holocaust, whatever that looks like in application, I would suggest it looks very different. But whatever he did later was the exact same principles that he was feeding people back here. He had the same policies and the same plans. So when it's tempting when watching some news, some of us are tempted to think that it's all right to support Hitler back here because at some stage he's going to do something bad and then we can see it. But whether it's 1933 or 1918 when Hitler decides on his path to power, or 1922 when he tries it with a military coup, or in 1933 when he begins his rise, or in 1939, or in 1941, or in 1945, at each point he's the exact same man with the exact same goals being driven by the exact same principles. The same lies and excuses that will be used to implement a Sunday law are the lies and excuses that are being used to implement his policies today. There is no change of the man between good and between bad. And I think we need to recognize that when we overlay this history as well. When we look at persecution beginning here, in 2019, the Night of Broken Glass, who was Hitler persecuting? The Jews. Why? Because he blamed the Jews for the lack of national prosperity. And when was he blaming them? All the way through. They're the people he's attacking back here for the reason that Germany is no longer great. He's going to make Germany great again by dealing with those Jews. That's what brought him to power, is people bought into that idea. Who is Trump attacking back here as being responsible for the lack of national prosperity? Muslims and immigrants, primarily immigrants. How do we see persecution here? We're always tempted to see things as they apply to us, that everything's about us. And while there are lines to show that we do enter into a period of persecution, and remember we're in an information war, we need to think about what that looks like. If we overlay the history of World War II, this isn't us. It's not about us. But what he does to us later on in this history is the excuses, the lies that are brought against us, he's doing right back here in this history as well. There is no change in the man. So what I've tried to bring out today, that we will look at again this afternoon, is how this message over hundreds of hours of studies has brought us to an understanding of Daniel 11 verse 40, two time of the ends that have the same characteristics, both being marked by a deadly wound in a much more complicated history. Then we came to understand that the king of the north resurrects after 1798, the king of the south resurrects after 1989. And it comes back into play, we first saw at the Battle of Raphia, where it again defeats the king of the north. Before it is finally defeated, the king of the south is fully defeated at another battle, the Battle of Panium. Then we came to overlay the history of World War II and saw that before this battle, these two are in an alliance, and we have a twofold war on the Western Front that precedes war on the Eastern Front. And we understand that we are in the middle of that right now. We're forced to consider what war looks like, what battles look like, because 2016 was a battle in history. 2018, we only have 2 days left. It has been a battle in history, and that is what I want us to look at. Raphia is a battle in history. It's being said a lot, has been said a lot, that we don't know what Raphia looks like. We should, because we have how many witnesses? 3. We have 1989 is a battle in history, and on the testimony of 2 or 3 a thing is established. We should not have, I would suggest, so many doubts about what Raphia looks like. So what I want to do this afternoon is take a more in-depth look of what happened in 2018, but in this relationship between Donald Trump and Putin. If you will kneel with... Oh, and the final point that I wanted to make was how we overlay the history, but we also take specific dates in that history to make a point. If you will kneel with me in prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you, Lord, for all of our blessings. Thank you that you do not leave us ignorant. Father, as we look into history, as we look into the Bible, how you have always told your people what is truth from what is error. You've always given us prophecy and understanding. Whatever kingdom or interaction that was, Lord, we were not to be ignorant of what was happening in these global events. I pray, Lord, that as we look at these things, that we will not be frightened. We know, Lord, that in history some terrible things happened, but Father, this is a different history, and you have a work that needs to be done to reach the world. So I pray, Father, that we'll do our part, that we will study as you would have us to study, that we'll be in unity, and that we'll be prepared, Father, to lay aside our preconceived ideas and do the work that you would have us to do. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.